All right, ladies and gentlemen, this is my discussion of the Great Depression. Let me move my window up a little bit. There you go. Topic 5, Great Depression, vocabulary and connections. I'm going to spend most of my time going over what you see in the concept map here, and then go over the causal links a little. And in going over this concept map, I'll be also talking to you about what's happening in the key causal links. At the end, I'll just scroll through so you can see what I highlighted as being important. So the big thing to start off with is that there are two primary causes of the Great Depression. The first is the laissez-faire economic policies built from the return to normalcy and the Republican presidential philosophy for laissez-faire economics. Remember that during the 20s, we have the presidencies of Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, all Republican presidents who believed in laissez-faire economics, shrinking the power of unions, removing a lot of the regulatory legislation that had been in place by the progressive presidents like McKinley, Theodore Roosevelt, and Woodrow Wilson, and returning to the kind of pro-business policies that we had seen from the Gilded Age. The other major thing that's going on is, in fact, a natural issue. It is the Dust Bowl, and the Dust Bowl is going to occur in the Plain States when, for various factors, crops, millions and millions of acres of crops are going to blow away. And so the agricultural infrastructure of the United States is going to collapse. And as we watch the video, if you watched the video on westward expansion, you know that the agricultural infrastructure for the United States is actually the backbone of much of the United States economy. So that turns into a really big problem. But let's back up. So laissez-faire economic policies from Republican presidential Republican presidents that included high tariffs, included destroying antitrust legislation, included weakening the bargaining power of unions, leads to business practices that support the growth of private industry but aren't very good for all of society. So it's good for the businessmen, but not necessarily good for the rest of us. One of the things that happens as a result of these laissez-faire economic policies is the ability to speculate. And to speculate is basically to gamble on stock. You speculate by buying stock really cheaply, and if enough people buy the stock, then the assumption is that the stock is worth something. So if you have stock that's really worth $1 per bond, and you have 300 people willing to buy it, then you start thinking that maybe the stock should actually be worth like $30 per bond, because it seems to be in high demand. When people drive up the cost of stock like this, their basic philosophy was they would drive up the cost of stock by investing in it rapidly, and then once the stock became really expensive, once it became worth a lot, then they would pull out their money, and so now the stock that they bought for $1 per bond is really $30. So they've made $29 on their investment. But if everyone is speculating in this way, everyone is really only investing in order to pull out of the stock a couple of days, months later, then you have wildly fluctuating values for stock that aren't representative of any true value. It's not related to how well the company is doing. It's not related to how much profit they made over the last year. It's simply based off of how many people are buying the stock and then selling the stock. And this fluctuation leads to a collapse in the New York Stock Exchange. And we call that collapse Black Friday. And so Black Friday is specifically this, the fluctuation and speculation causes folks to become extremely concerned about the real value of stock, and so they decide that they are going to actually pull out of various investing in various companies because their money isn't worth as much as they think that it's worth. And here we come to a problem. Because banks, the American banking system, had invested in the same corporations in the same kind of way. They had speculated as well. But they had been using the money that the average American put into their bank. So you go to your bank, Chase, Bank of America, whatever, the Bank of Texas, whatever it is, and you deposit $3,000 into a savings account there. The bank then took your $3,000 and used it to speculate in the stock market. Now, if you get to Black Friday and you hear about how all of the stock is overpriced and it's not worth anything, and all these people are pulling out of different investments, then you have the banks. Then, so as people take their money out of the different investments that they had in the stock, the value of that stock decreases. So the $3,000 that your bank spent into the stock market isn't worth $3,000 anymore. It's worth a tenth of that. So you get a 10 cents for every dollar that you put in, which means that you would come out to only having $300 at the end. So this frightens many Americans, and they start to run to their banks and to try to pull out the actual amount of cash that they had put in. So if you hear that the bank's collapsing because they made bad bets in the stock exchange, you're like, well, I want to go get my $3,000 because they're giving me all of my money back. But if you want your $3,000 and someone else wants their $1,000 and someone else wants their $400, but the bank doesn't actually have that kind of hard cash on hand because they invested it, then banks fail. And this failure of banks happens during the presidency of Hoover, because remember the stock exchange crash is in 29, and the Federal Reserve, rather than make a bunch of, so when you have bank failures, you need to add to this. Federal Reserve, coming off of here, Federal Reserve refuses to make more money. So it's not just a problem that the banks are failing. It's that the Federal Reserve, which is the nationalized banking system that we have, right, rather than make more dollar bills and just make up for the amount of money that banks don't have, rescue the banks, basically, if you're looking at like what we did in the current day examples. Rather than rescuing the banks, because they have this laissez-faire economic policy that says business does what business does and the government shouldn't be involved, the banks fail. They don't have enough money to pay people, and then therefore people have like their life savings is depleted because the bank does not have their money. Banks close down, they go out of business, and we're starting to see what will become the Great Depression. So remember, the stock market crash and Black Friday all happened in 29. So we're still a couple of years prior to what we will think of as the height of the Depression. So what is also happening at that time? Now, we already learned that during the 1920s, like farms were beginning to fail because there was a boom from World War I where the federal government subsidized, that means paid for, farmers to farm large crops so that they could have rations to send to soldiers and all that business. But when the war ends in 1919, the farm subsidies dry up, and so now farmers are left with, they've been making tons and tons of, say they were making 3 acres worth of corn. They farmed 3 acres worth of corn every year, and they gave all of that basically to the government. The government just bought it. Now that the subsidies are done, they have 3 acres of corn, no one to buy the corn. There's no need for the corn, so they have no way to sell the produce that they've made. They have invested so much in the particular, crop that they that they farm, that they can't just switch crops, and the crop that they have farmed and they've brought to is not sellable. So they already farmers by the mid 20s, the agricultural economy is like starting to disintegrate. And then the Dust Bowl happens. And so the Dust Bowl is partially about the overproduction of soil. So like I said, the U.S. government is paying people to farm particular kinds of crops that may not have been very good for the kind of climate that they were being farmed in. And so through technology, we were capable of still creating these farms, but what winds up happening is that it erodes the soil to the point that to the point that it's very hard to plant new crops and to have them flourish. At the same time, there's a severe drought that happens in the Midwest. So the soil has gone bad. There's not enough water to water the plants. There's not enough rain. There's not an irrigation to water the plants. So then crops are dying, or it's becoming almost impossible to plant a crop that will actually last and make it to the point where you can sell that crop. So the agricultural industry, it disintegrates. And once that disintegrates, and the banks have failed, then many businesses are beginning to fail, and we start to see what we think of as the Great Depression. The high unemployment. This leads to things like the bonus army, and you'll see this is a movement of veterans who go to Washington D.C. to try and get the money that they're owed from their veteran status from the government. The government actually treats them quite shady and pushes them out of the Capitol and doesn't pay them. You also have a high transient population. Particularly, we learn about this in terms of Okies, who are folks from Oklahoma who are migrating to California. There's a great novel, The Grapes of Wrath, that's based on this migration, but a general migration of people, from farmers, right, from the Midwest out further west into California, and in order to attempt to find jobs that by and large didn't exist, that brought them into competition with the Mexican migrant workers who were already working the farms in California, not necessarily decreasing the racial ethnic tension that existed already. And so then what happens? You have the election of 1932, where Herbert Hoover is being opposed by a new candidate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt is pretty primed to win because no one is happy with what Hoover has done during the Depression. They call most of the things that are negative about the economy, they call Hoover. They're Hoovervilles, which are the small towns that transient people build. You just have this general belief that Herbert Hoover has failed the country. And so FDR is elected. When he is elected, in his first 100 days, he proposes something called the New Deal. The New Deal is going to be a set of policies that attempt to end the Depression. And they're going to be about relief, reform, and recovery, giving relief to people who need it desperately because of the lack of jobs and income, reform the laws in order to make it easier to rebuild the economy, and then recovery to put people to work to start rebuilding America. These 3 R's are going to be pushed through alphabet soup, which is the concept of the different agencies that Roosevelt is going to create. However, the Supreme Court isn't going to really like it, and they're going to feel like he was overstepping his bounds as president. And in order to get back at them, he's going to attempt to create a new law that allows him to put more people in the Supreme Court, which is highly illegal. All right, so then I'm going to just scroll through right quick so you can see what I highlighted in the notes. Pretty simple. Alphabet soup and court packing scheme. Here, let me go back to court packing scheme, and I'll